So we get to the next section of this where we actually find out the horrifying nature of this particular story that Mitchell Sanders is narrating to us. He says, the guys imagine that they're hearing music that they would hear at a cocktail party. And he says at the end, real hoity-toity, all very civilized, except this isn't civilization, this is Nam. So in this particular anecdote, the reality is the subjective truth of paranoia. That actually the experience of paranoia and the experience of hallucination is partly what we've got here in this particular story, not necessarily whether the details of the specific music that they're talking about is accurate. He says, anyways, the guys try to be cool, they just lie there and groove, but after a while they start hearing, you won't believe this, they hear chamber music, they hear violins and shit. And then at the end, this becomes even more surreal. He says, the rocket's talking, and the fog too, and the grass and the goddamn mongooses. Everything talks. The trees talk politics, the monkeys talk religion, the whole country. Vietnam, the place talks. Now, again, the surrealistic imagery is supposed to capture the subjective truth of the emotional state of paranoia and anxiety. But the irony about this is that the scenery and the setting and the place seems to be speaking because these soldiers can't. You know, the hallucination seems to be along the lines of the fact that because they aren't able to talk, because they are keeping everything bound up and trapped, the place itself seems to be making all the noise for them. And so actually, it's the truth of the emotional state that, again, is the basis of this. The guys can't cope, they lose it, and this is when we get the consequence. And this is very deliberately and stylistically written like rhetoric. And you'll notice here a particular rhetorical device called anaphora, where you start a particular sentence or a range of sentences with the same word or phrase. They lose it. They get on the radio and report enemy movement, a whole army, they say, and they order up a firepower. They get arty and gunships. Arty is artillery. They call in airstrikes, and I'll tell you, they fucking crash that cocktail party. All night long, they just smoke those mountains. They make jungle juice. They blow away trees and glee clubs and whatever there is to blow away. Scorched time. They walk napalm up and down the ridges. They bring in the Cobras and F4s. They use Willie Peter and HE and incendiaries. It's all fire. They make those mountains burn. And so again, in this particular passage, you've got the rhetoric capturing the cathartic nature of the experience that he's describing. This is an unleashing of feeling because it's been trapped in this particular moment where they haven't been able to speak. So we have this almost speech-like, sort of angry, cathartic language, where the language is a venting of emotion, of bound-up emotion, that is supposed to capture the horrifying consequences of the experience that are stemming from the act of not being able to talk, not being able to communicate, not being able to speak. And so everything gets quiet, and they're off in the special zone, and there's not a single sound, they say, except they still hear it. And so again, we've got this suggestion here that whatever sound they were listening to, it wasn't something that could be wiped out by artillery and gunfire. It was something possibly as a product of their own imagination. So they pack up and start humping. They head down the mountain back to base camp, and when they get there, they don't say diddly. They don't talk, not a word, like they're deaf and dumb. Later on, this fat bird colonel comes up and asks what the hell happened out there. What did they hear? Why all the ordnance, all the weaponry? The man's ragged out. He gets down tight on their case. I mean, they spent $6 trillion on firepower, and this fat-ass colonel wants answers. He wants to know what the fucking story is. But the guys don't say zip. They just look at him for a while, sort of funny-like, sort of amazed, and the whole war is right there in that stare. It says everything you can't ever say. It says, man, you got wax in your ears. It says, poor bastard, you'll never know. Wrong frequency. You don't even want to hear this. Then they salute the fucker and walk away because certain stories you don't ever tell. And so in this case, the storytelling motif resurfaces as a failure to be able to capture the truth of an absurd experience because the person isn't listening right. They're not listening for the experience that led to this particular outcome. They're listening for clear categories. They're listening for moralizing. They're listening for cause and effect reasons, from the perspective of a supervisor. And so, you look here, there's a refusal of storytelling and a sense of the inadequacy of language in the face of the absurdity of the experience, which provides the impetus and the need for Mitchell Sanders to recollect this story, and more broadly for all of the text itself, that the text itself needs writing because of stories like this, and because the fact that people don't listen for the right experiences when they try and understand them. And so we've got a sense, I think, of anger here in this final aspect of Mitchell Sanders' anecdote. So, again, there's a digression. You can tell a true war story by the way it never seems to end. Not then, not ever. Not when Mitchell Sanders stood up and moved off into the dark. It all happened. Even now I remember that yo-yo. In a way, suppose you had to be there, you had to hear it, but I could tell how desperately Sanders wanted me to believe him. His frustration at not quite getting the details right, not quite pinning down the final and definitive truth. And so both of them, Sanders as a character and Tim O'Brien, are both engaged in effortful storytelling that gives them, I think, a natural sense of empathy with each other as characters and as real individuals indeed. But this reflection here, this metafictional digression, is a way of reflecting on the previous story again, reflecting on Mitchell Sanders' anecdote and his narrative, and his sense of frustration at not being able to communicate truth. But this again, this speaks to to this story itself and the wider text that this is written in, the things they carried. He goes on, O'Brien. I remember sitting at my foxhole that night watching the shadows of the Quangai, thinking about the coming day and how we would cross the river and march west into the mountains, all the ways I might die and the things I did not understand. And here, this phrase is everything that the story communicates, not this that is difficult to make sense of, the absurdity of experience that makes all of this difficult to understand, and what makes him, in many ways, the ideal audience for a war story from Mitchell Sanders. This absurd experience, it's all of these things that mean that subjective truth is valued. Late in the night, Mitchell Sanders touched my shoulder. Just came to me, he whispered. The moral, I mean. Nobody listens. Nobody hears nothing. Like that fat-ass colonel, the politicians, all the civilian types, what they need is to go out on LP. The vapors, man. Trees and rocks. You've got to listen to your enemy. And so here, Mitchell Sanders as a character is exposed as looking for a moral in the story. But again, this is invoked as a reception of truth, that no one hears anything, nobody listens. So the moral of this story is the fact that it wasn't received right. The story itself wasn't understood and comprehended. The politicians, all the civilian types, what they need is to go out on LP. You need to go and experience this to be able to actually listen to the story. But this is what presses on storytelling generally, is that it needs to capture these absurd experiences and these details. And then again in the morning, Sanders came up to me. The platoon was preparing to move out, checking weapons, going through all the little rituals that preceded the day's march. Already the lead squad had crossed the river and was filing off toward the west. I got a confession to make, Sanders said. Last night, man, I had to make up a few things. I know that. The Glee Club, there wasn't any Glee Club, right? No opera. Forget it, I understand. Yeah, but listen, it's still true. Those 6 guys, they heard wicked sound out there. They heard sound you just plain wouldn't believe. Sanders pulled on his rucksack, closed his eyes for a moment, then almost smiled at me. And so again, this is a metafictional digression. It is reflecting on the act of his storytelling, and it's putting into practice both the haunting nature of the experience as the subjective truth in the experience that was vital to understand, but also the way that, as O'Brien explains earlier in the text, or the narrator of this story explains earlier in the text, that you have to make up some of the details in order for the story to have the ability to communicate the subjective nature of the truth. And so here, what he's telling us is that some of these slightly more elaborate details, the Glee Club, the opera, have been added in to capture the overall haunting nature of the experience of hearing sound out there that you just plain wouldn't believe. And there's a sense here of his satisfaction in the act of storytelling that we see in his narration. I knew what was coming, but I beat him to it. All right, I said. What's the moral? Forget it. No, go ahead. For a long while he was quiet, looking away, and the silence kept stretching out until it was almost embarrassing. Then he shrugged and gave me a stare that lasted all day. Hear that, quiet man? There's your moral. And so again, they're sort of searching for truth in this particular story, but the silence itself, or I think as a symbol of the indifference of people when they listen to war stories and their lack of interest in the nature of the experience, is what in the end stands for this story. If there is a morality, it's not really that there is a moral to this story. It's simply that people don't listen carefully enough to them to understand them properly.